How will we power our future? Can we create a healthy and clean economy? Climate One at the Commonwealth Club is at the forefront of the global debate about energy, economy, and the environment. Bringing together the brightest and most provocative leaders of our time, Climate One is the place where big ideas get heard. With thoughtful and insightful discussions on policy, business, science, and culture, Climate One founder Greg Dalton gets to the heart of the matter. It's our future. It's time to come together.
This fall marks the 50th anniversary of the seminal book Diet for a Small Planet, in which Frances Moore Lappé argued that cattle constitute a protein factory in reverse. She inspired countless people to adopt a vegetarian diet. Together with her daughter Anna Lappé, author of Diet for a Hot Planet, the two now focus on the intersections between food, democracy, environment, and justice. Diet for a Threatened Planet, today on Climate One. Frances, your aha moment occurred when you were 26 years old and a graduate student at Berkeley. Headlines were telling us we need running out of food. What did you realize in that seminal moment?
Well, the first shock was to realize that this scarcity scare message that was being proliferating everywhere, Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, had exploded, and everyone was terrified that we were literally running out of capacity to feed ourselves. But it was that sense of desperation, and young women were saying, I can't have children because we're overrunning the earth. It would not be right for me. And I thought, if I could just understand why is there hunger in the world, if I could just tackle that key question of food, that would unlock the mysteries of economics and politics, and I'd figure out a path for my life. So fortunately, I had access to one of the best agricultural libraries, the University of California at Berkeley, and I went in with my dad's slide rule. Probably most of our viewers don't even know what that is today, but I still have my dad's. And I literally started putting two and two together with the help of friendly librarians. And the big aha was, wait a minute, we are actively creating scarcity, the experience of scarcity, that is, for millions and millions of people. There is no absolute scarcity. There is plenty of potential for us all to eat well. And I just had to tell the world. So Greg, I wrote a one-page handout, and I thought it was such great news that actually, because we're creating it, we humans, we can end it. And I thought people would just say, yeah, right, how do we do that? And so that was the beginning for me, but it was to realize that our whole system was so incredibly wasteful, and that there was abundance if we would reorganize so that everyone who was hungry had access to what potential there is. So I could go on and on about those ahas, but that was the first.
What was your diet like when you were growing up,
Well,
Frances?
let me tell you, I grew up in Cowtown. Literally, it was called Cowtown. And I could almost smell the stockyards from where I lived, right? It was Fort Worth, Texas. And what was a meal without meat? It did not exist. So I grew up in that culture of just presumption that the center of the plate was a big slab of some kind of meat. And so it was kind of shocking to the girl from Cowtown saying, wait a minute, cows are a big problem. Of course, I didn't know how big a problem they were then. But it was really that sense of we are creating the experience of scarcity out of plenty that was the calling for the rest of my life. Like, why would this bright species create the world that none of us as individuals would ever choose? Because no one chooses to force others to go hungry or to degrade the earth. So that's been the leading question of my life. Why are we creating a world together that as individuals we abhor? So that's kept me going for 77 years. Well, not since then, but for a good 50 years since I wrote Diet for a Small Planet. Yeah.
And Diet for a Small Planet changed the eating habits of generations, and we'll get into that with Anna. Did it change your parents' habits or any of those people back in Cowtown?
I can't say it was made a huge change, although for my parents' generation, although they were very supportive of me, I just found the copy that I inscribed to them. They were very supportive. But I did feel that I was part of a culture that was saying, yes, yes, yes. It was that moment where we were questioning so much, coming out of the 60s. where we felt like we could make progress on civil rights, we could make progress on political rights. And so I felt really supported. And in Berkeley at that time, there was a lot going on. I love it that Alice Waters' Open Shape the very month that Diet for a Small Planet was published.
Mm.
And there was just a lot of back to the land energy, that we can go back to the land and grow our food. And I felt like I was really part of that awakening to our relationship to the earth has to be rethought, and and it can be abundant for all if we restructure.
And we'll get into some things you didn't realize at that time when climate
Yes.
was not really part of
No.
the conversation. But when you wrote Diet for a Small Planet, you had never heard of agroforestry. What is agroforestry and why do you find it so exciting?
Well, growing up in Texas and driving around, outside on the way to Oklahoma to camp, all you saw were big fields of monoculture of feed grains. And it never occurred to me that trees and crops could be friends and actually help each other. And, that was the opposite of my sense of agriculture. And it was really, I don't know, when I first got captivated by this, I was working on a book on world hunger more than a decade ago, and I just was entranced with one of the poorest countries in the entire world is Niger. And there, after colonialism had, led to a lot of tree cutting, that at the end of colonialism there, the farmers started remembering and reviving their traditional practices, which had included the mixing of trees and crops. And it
Mhm.
turns out that in that very warm climate of limited rainfall, that actually trees help the plants grow, because help the crops grow because it helps to shade the soil so evaporation doesn't happen as fast. It provides fodder, for livestock, but also leaves that can be used as part of um, the fertilization of the soil, and enriching it. So there was a whole shift then away from a monoculture toward the interweaving of trees and forests, and millions of trees were then reestablished, those that had been cut, because it turns out if you just leave a stump alone and it has little sprouts coming out, it will reestablish itself. And so that transformation then is spreading um, south as well into other um, areas of sub-Saharan Africa. And I was just so moved by it because it was building on the best of traditional practice and building on a knowledge base that was really led. It was called farmer managed natural regeneration is the acronym, which I love. So to really emphasize that it's farmers who are creating this synergy.
Anna, what are some of your earliest memories around food and growing up as the daughter of a woman from Cowtown?
Well, I'm sort of like, the fish that lives in water. You don't know anything else. But, uh, I definitely was raised, if any listeners or viewers read Diet for a Small Planet, yes, I was raised on the walnut cheddar loaf and on all of those recipes in there. The book came out a couple years before I was born. But to be honest, my most vivid memories of my childhood, well, I would say they're as much in the kitchen as they were in the streets. When I was young, my mother had just co-founded the Institute for Food and Development Policy, and a lot of their work was actually about, yes, about diets and changing diets, but also about foreign policy. And at the time we were living in San Francisco, there was a lot of organizing around Central American solidarity. And so I have vivid memories of marching in the streets. And probably my most vivid childhood memory, earliest one, was actually traveling with my mother and my older brother to Guatemala, where she was there to learn Spanish, but also about land reform. Absolutely, like, photographic memory of this moment of sitting atop this hill of this town where we were living at the time, where she was studying Spanish and researching agricultural reforms there, and looking out and being able to see with the child's eyes so visibly the inequality in front of us. So this large landowner that had all this land, and then all of these small homes, stacked close together, and asking my brother and I these questions about, why is that? Why is there some people that have so much and some people that have so little? And so I would say, I always like to say, growing up with my mother, yes, like, she cared about what was on our plate, but she also cared about what was was happening outside in the world and getting us as young people to be asking those big questions.
Well, Anna, what are the implications of industrial agriculture, which is concentrated power, for democracy and food justice?
Yeah, well, the implications, we're seeing it every day. The implications is an incredible stranglehold on the decision makers who are supposed to be serving the public interest. My mother and I were just looking at the latest figures from OpenSecrets.org about how many lobbyists there are for agribusiness and how much they're spending. And in just 2020 alone, agribusiness spent $140 million that year alone to lobby on behalf of their interests. And that's actually, they had about, what was it, about 1,100 lobbyists, 60% of whom were former government employees. So this kind of revolving door, as people talk about, between government and industry. And so what, has really only increased in these last 50 years is a consolidation of industry. So you have just a few corporations controlling much of the meat packing in this country, just a few controlling much of the food retailing. And as a result, you have this kind of influence on government regulations that's creating a kind of food environment that makes it really hard for farmers to transition off of pesticides and synthetic fertilizers that are so bad for the climate. That makes it hard for everyday people to access the kinds of really nourishing, nutrient-dense whole foods that we should all be eating. And so, it's really important that we understand that in order to change our food environment, we need to really work to get money out of politics, and we really need to work on how to take on that kind of consolidated power in the industry.
Well, Frances Moore Lappé, with alarm bells ringing so loud on the climate emergency, is democracy up to the task? Is it
Not,
fast enough?
not the democracy as we experience it here in the United States. This is the proof of the pudding is in the eating, right? I mean, we aren't stepping up yet. So I couldn't stress more that we all need to know that we can sort of, what is the metaphor? Chew gum and walk at the same time. We can be democracy advocates and climate change activists, and we have to make clear that connection always in our hearts. Make clear that connection, because we're not doing it, and we rank, just to motivate. I've looked at where we score relative to other democracies and the quality of our democracy, and we are literally behind dozens of other countries. And so we can't succeed with this level of exactly what Anna was just talking about, where money has so much power within our system. And that wasn't true as much at all when I wrote Diet for Small Planet. I just want to point out, during the 1970s, there were not these armies of lobbyists in Washington. That started coming with the Reagan years and after. But the number of lobbyists, I think, increased 14-fold in the decade after, I wrote Diet for a Small Planet.
It's so urgent that we need to act quickly and globally. And I want to challenge you a little bit on the notion that concentrated and big is always bad. Large corporations can act on global scale. Organic food is still only about 1% of American cropland, but the industry is tens of billions of dollars. But is big always bad? Sometimes some people would look to, Walmart getting into sustainability practices, organics, et cetera, that has real power. Is that bad power?
Well, I'd like Anna to weigh in on this too, but my answer to that is that it's not about scale, it's about who's in control. And that's why the democracy piece of it, if we have to crawl and beg, a corporation answering to shareholders and not to the broad public, that's really ties our hands. And so we need democracy answering to us so that we can put the standards, place the standards on all of our interaction with the earth, and guidelines and sources that of funding that are going toward the farmers who've already proven that they can farm ecologically. So I really want to emphasize that it really is fundamentally about who's answering to whom. Are we, the public and public interest, setting the standards, enforcing those standards, answering to long-term viability of life on Earth. And right now, private corporations, they may be doing it for some motive, but it's not that public motive.
And Anna, there are some industrial organic producers that are quite huge, right? What's your
Yeah.
take on?
Yeah. Well, I just want to add on to how my mom began to answer that question, which is about that question of in whose interest are these companies acting, and how do we scale up in the public interest? And I think one of the most powerful ways to do that is to tap into the power of governments that, again, are supposed to be working on behalf of the public good. And there's so much potential power, and a lot of climate activists are talking about the power of procurement, they call it. So the government is purchasing a lot of energy, but guess what? Also a lot of food. And so one of the ways that a lot of the folks that I work with across the US, but also around the world, are exploring to really change systems quickly. We know we need to move fast around climate. We know we need to move fast around biodiversity collapse and its ties to overuse of pesticides. One of the things we can tap into is the fact that state governments are spending billions on food every year. And can we use those dollars and move it into the public interest? One policy that colleagues of mine have been working on adapting and adopting and exploring around the country is called the Good Food Purchasing Program. And it's a model policy used by now school districts, a number of them across the country, to say, if we, a public entity, is going to be buying food, let's bring our values into it. Let's not just choose the cheapest. Let's think about climate. Let's think about health. Let's think about the local economy. Let's think about workers. And in so doing, we're seeing really exciting supply chain changes on scale, at scale. And that to me is really an exciting example of how we can operate and make change fast.
Right, and college students are pushing for that kind of change as well on college campuses, which are often serviced by very large corporations. Anna, what are some of the biggest myths about how we eat and the system that produces our food? You're into myth busting.
Well, I think one of the biggest myths is that the food that we see out there was somehow created out of consumer demand. And in Diet for a Small Planet, my mom has this chapter I've always loved called Who Asked for Fruit Loops? And, it's like, did any parent ever say, you know what I would love? I would love a company to create a product that's irresistible to my children and delivers to them more sugar than they should be eating for an entire day. No parent asked for that. Smart marketers developed it, right? And product designers. And so, I think it's about looking at how do we actually, again, have a food environment that is serving the public interest, not just, helping a few companies gain huge amounts of profit.
Frances, I want to ask you about, why nitrogen is important and why it's not talked about more in the climate conversation. Nitrous oxide is often overlooked.
Well, there's nitrous oxide, and then there's the nitrogen overload in general. And nitrous oxide is a very, very powerful greenhouse gas. And so that is and it's throughout our industrial ag system is relying on it. And so that's a real hazard. And then the nitrogen that leaches into our waterways. I have talked about this in the new chapter of Diet for a Small Planet, because it's been so missed that nitrogen runoff then goes down through the system out into the Gulf of Mexico in the US and creates a dead zone there that is, I believe, as large as the state that I live in, Massachusetts. So there is just this incredible negative loop here all the way around, that just is so unnecessary when we can create ecological systems so that you have organisms that are generating the nitrogen that plants need. And that is what agroecology is all about, where it's really working with the soil organisms to nourish the plants. So I think nitrogen, nitrous oxide are two aspects that are really underestimated in the damage that is being done. How I that we're killing ourselves to feed ourselves. That not a good deal. That we do not need this.
And in 2006, there was a seminal report from the UN Food and Agricultural Organization called Livestock's Long Shadow. It was the first time scientists parsed out the climate impacts of cattle. What impact did that have on you in the broader climate conversation?
Yeah, so that report was what set me on the path to write Diet for a Hot Planet, because in that report, as you said, scientists looked at for the first time what do we know about livestock's impact, both from indirectly and directly in terms of their environmental and climate costs. So looking at the amount of land being used to grow feed crops, the role of livestock grazing and feed crop production in terms of deforestation. And at the time, what the researchers found is that livestock production alone, again, directly and indirectly, was responsible at the time for about 14.5% of all greenhouse gas emissions, which at the time was more than all planes, trains, and automobiles combined. If you think about that moment, that was right around the same time that An Inconvenient Truth came out and the climate conversation was taking off. And yet I read this report and then I was reading the climate conversation and I realized people were not putting food and food systems more broadly into that conversation. Keep in mind that, of course, we don't just eat meat and dairy. When we talk about livestock, that's just one piece of the food systems. Shortly after that report came out, other researchers tried to look at overall how much uh, food was responsible for the climate crisis and estimated about a third of all emissions. A new report came out more recently estimating about the same, about 37%. So huge, huge impact on climate. And I ended up writing Diet for a Hot Planet because I wanted to understand, why was this not being talked about? Why were climate advocates not looking at food systems change? And why were folks working on food systems change not realizing how much their work connected to climate? And one of the things that came out of that research that was so edifying for me was to learn that in addressing the damage that food systems do on climate, in looking at how can we shift them to ways of growing food that actually reduce the climate load, that actually at the very same time, those solutions are going to make farms more resilient to climate shocks. In other words, they're going to make soil more absorbent, more able to handle drought periods and flooding events, that it's going to push farmers and support farmers in moving toward growing a more diverse set of crops, which is good for our health as well as resiliency, so that there were all of these co-benefits too. And that was so exciting to realize that, yes, we can think of food systems as part of the casualty of this crisis, right? That farmers are on the front lines, that they're a huge cause of the crisis, but also they really are, farmers and folks working on food systems, a key part of our solutions to get us out of this climate catastrophe.
And if eating animals is so bad for the health of humans and the planet, why are you so critical of meat made from plants by companies such as Impossible, Beyond Meat? Isn't displacing meat a good thing?
Uh, Great question, Greg. And I would say in your question and how you ask that question is fundamentally my question about these alternative meat products, which is, are they actually displacing meat and dairy consumption? So you're talking about this huge new market for products that might look and taste like meat, but that are plant-based. And one of the arguments that I hear from investors into this space and to proponents of this whole new line of products is, hey, we're going to create these products and we're going to see a decrease in meat and dairy consumption as a result. And I will be really curious to see if that plays out. What I am seeing and hearing from the companies that are moving into the space, some of which are the biggest meat companies in the world. So Tyson Foods, for instance, just bought up some small alternative meat, plant-based meat companies. And in their pitch to investors and analysts, they said, they want to be really clear. This is both and. They are both growing their desire for expanding their market share in their meat lines, and they are growing these plant-based products. And so my concern would be, let's be really clear-eyed. Are these products actually decreasing our consumption of meat and dairy? And I would say, really, the way we're going to make the kind of rapid shift away from the overconsumption of meat and dairy in just a handful of countries that are really seriously over-consuming meat and dairy is going to come from policy changes and regulation changes that are going to make really the polluters pay, make the companies that are essentially getting subsidized to produce meat and dairy that's highly industrialized, not good for the environment, not good for our bodies. That's how we're going to see really rapid change. And while it's great, I have no problem with having more choice in the marketplace for consumers. I think, as you know, Greg, knowing we need to move so fast on these triple crises around the climate, public health and nutrition and biodiversity, we really need to be trying to put all of our energy toward growing more healthy whole foods, not more ultra processed foods, whether that's ultra processed meat or ultra processed meat-like products.
Right. And I wanted to unpack a little bit that message from large meat industry packing companies. Is it'd be very difficult for them to say, we're creating this new plant-based meat. And by the way, we're going to put all the cattle ranchers out of business that we depend on for now. That would be kind of a very difficult, almost suicidal thing for a company to say, hey, cattle ranchers who supply us with the beef we need, we're going to put you out of business. So stay in business until we put you out of it. Right.
Well, what you're hinting at there too is this whole framework around a just transition, right? How do we ensure that the folks that are working in industries that we know we need to sunset? I mean, coal, for instance, is an example of one. I would say the folks that are working in the fracked gas industry, there's a number of industries that we know we need to sunset in order to meet our climate goals of not sending us off a climate cliff. And we absolutely need to be thinking about how do we create good jobs and jobs that are not going to hurt the workers who are employed in them. And I would argue, you look at meatpacking, it's one of the most exploitive and injury prone jobs in the economy. Let's make sure that those people who stay in meatpacking have good jobs that pay a decent wage, and those who are transitioning out have access to good jobs that also pay a decent wage.
Podcasts of this and other Climate One shows are available wherever you get your podcast. Talking about climate can be awkward and depressing and difficult. It also can be interesting and exciting, as you've seen today. So please help us get more people talking about climate. Thanks for joining us online. We'll see you next time, everybody.